during COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on media. Indian media today is going through a very critical phase when freedom of the press and journalistic integrity both are at stake. During such a juncture, it is indeed a privilege to welcome amongst us today two veteran journalists who have ably demonstrated through their work that it is indeed possible to uphold the highest standards of journalistic ethics and stand up for press freedom even in the midst of the most challenging circumstances. Mr. A.S. Paneerselvan, reader's editor of The Hindu, and Ms. Ammu Joseph, independent journalist and author. We are immensely grateful to both of them for consenting to share their valuable thoughts, which will definitely help all of us, including our students, in defining and redefining the role of media in nation building and also in the times of humanitarian crisis like the present ones. We are also honored to have with us today Professor V.K. Jain, Vice Chancellor, Tejpur University. Thank you so much for your kind presence, sir. We have also been joined today by a host of media professionals, media educators, students, and other well-wishers. We extend our warm welcome and gratitude to everyone. To begin the program, I now invite upon Professor Abhijit Bora, the convener of today's Press Day celebrations, to give an introduction to the program.
Good afternoon to all of you, my respected invited speakers, Mr. A.S. Paneerselvan sir and Madam Ammu Joseph, our Vice Chancellor sir, my colleague faculty members and professionals from other institutes as well, and my very dear students. Today, it's our privilege to have two such prominent journalists who would be sharing their experiences in this on this auspicious occasion. When it is a day for reminiscing about our past days, what we have done, what we can do, how we can improvise our working habits, etc., and what strategies we can take for improvising the general standard of the profession, etc. This year, the situation is a special one because of the corona pandemic situation. This morning, I was talking to the local journalists here in Tezpur itself. I was telling them that journalists have been doing no less, and they have been playing no less a role than medical practitioners, civil and police administration, etc. At the time when the pandemic was at its peak, even then, journalists, especially those in the Mofussil areas, etc., had to go without PPE kits or any other such safety measures, which the concept itself was not there initially, and keep the wheel of news presentation running without any glitch. Right. This is why they do deserve a pat on the back, and it is also a great opportunity to think about the future, how we can re-strategize or how we can improvise our working strategies for the future. This is an occasion on which we felt it would be important for especially for our students, when they will be hearing from field practitioners about various aspects of life. And it is also our privilege to have the view also from the other side of the field, that is the ombudsman's position, and one from the practicing journalist's position. So that way, I believe our students as well as all the participants will be benefited to a great extent by today's deliberations, and looking forward to a very meaningful and long-lasting relationship. I will conclude here, and now our HOD will speak a few words. Anjuman, please take over.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Bora. I now request Professor Jaya Chakravarti, Head of the Department, Mass Communication and Journalism, Tezpur University, to deliver the welcome address.
Thank you, Anjuman. This is indeed a great occasion. The National Press Day that we are organizing today, and on this theme or within the Corona context, and the theme this year is also within a Corona context, and very much affected by it. We are organizing it in online mode. Every time we try and organize it face to face. And indeed, I would start by saying that the department has lost this great opportunity of hosting two leading media professionals, Mr. Paneerselvan and Madam Amu Joseph, uh, on our campus. Sir had visited us once, but then we did not ever have the good luck of hosting Madam Joseph on campus. So, but thank you, both of you, for agreeing to be part of this event that we are trying to organize today on the theme of broad theme that is given by the PCI this year, the role of media during COVID-19 and its impact on media. Interestingly, we have seen that how even profession one side, but as teachers, we have seen the impact that we are feeling in the media education. So maybe not in terms of media practice, I would want to say that in terms of media and communication education, the impact that we felt of COVID-19, we have not been able to give the hands-on training that is so much important for the media students. The two MA programs that we run in our department, MA in Mass Communication and Journalism and MA in Communication for Development, in both these cases, we emphasize a lot in praxis, in the practice-oriented learning. So in both cases, we have felt a great loss that we have not been able to impart the appropriate training via the online mode. So as teachers, we have started learning now as to how to teach online. That it has also been a learning phase for us. We have been improvising, we have been trying to see that how we can teach and how in this process in the online mode, we are able to inculcate the values, the ethics, the technicalities, the expertise, and the skills which are required of communication professionals, of media professionals. Our MA in Communication for Development program is entirely field oriented. They go for 6 months internship. They have a lot of field work to do. Our other students, they do a lot of production. MA-MCJ students, they do a lot of studio-based and outdoor productions. We have not been able to provide all that training, and we will try and see how we are able to compensate it once they come back to campus. So when there is a shortage in terms of training that we are imparting, and they are going to enter the industry within a few days, within a few months, so we can understand what its impact has been. We have also seen that how it is impacting in both ways in terms of the lack of resources for the media industry, how it has impacted the life of the media professionals, their jobs, their security, their health. All of that, it's a very complicated situation as far as the media scenario is concerned in India. Given its importance, both in terms of the development communication practitioners as well as the mass media professionals, how important communication has become within the current crisis context that we are having. So in this situation, it is indeed a very great opportunity for us that we have someone like Mr. S. Paneerselvan, who is going to speak in one direction, and then we have Madam Amu Joseph, who is going to bring a very different perspective to her. And I believe this is going to be an extremely learning opportunity for our students, that you have agreed to be here with us, you have agreed to share your thoughts with us. I extend my heartfelt thanks to both of you, and I welcome you to this, virtually I welcome you to our department, that you have come here and you are sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you, sir. Thank you, madam, a lot for being here. So I hand over to Anjuman. You can carry it forward.
Thank you so much, Joy ma'am. May I now invite upon Professor V.K. Jain, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Tejpur University, to deliver the inaugural address. However, before I give away screen space to Sir, I would like to briefly introduce Sir for the benefit of everyone in the house. Professor V.K. Jain, before assuming office as Vice Chancellor of Tejpur University, he was a professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University and also Pro Vice Chancellor, Doon University. A seasoned academician, Professor Jain studied BSc from Agra University and completed MSc from Aligarh Muslim University. He was conferred DPhil from Sussex University, Brighton, UK in 1982. Professor Jain began his teaching career at Sussex University by teaching the undergraduate laboratory students. Later, he served as a scientist class 1 in the Department of Physics, Indian Institute of Technology, New Delhi, before embarking his journey as an academician when he joined School of Environmental Sciences, JNU, as associate professor in 1985. He taught MSc and MPhil classes for about 25 years at JNU. Professor Jain has been actively involved in research activities for the past 4 decades, and he has a large number of research publications to his credit. Professor Jain has been member of many statutory bodies, such as member on panel of experts of University Grants Commission, Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, Union Public Service Commission, Public Service Commission of Himachal Pradesh, and Public Service Commission of Uttar Pradesh. So it's an honor to have you, sir. Kindly take the screen space.
Thank you, Anjuman ji. First of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me to this event, for observing the National Press Day. I'm looking forward to actually listening to two of these eminent journalists, Paneer Sedwan Sahab and Ammu Joseph, madam. So I don't have much to say except that whatever little, based on my own experience about the way the press reports in this country and in general across the world, I would just like to share my thoughts with you. Well, as has been mentioned by Anjuman ji, this day reminds us about the importance of the ethical reporting as well as the freedom of the press, which is so crucial for a very vibrant democracy such as ours. It is so essential for accountability of the governance system and for ensuring the welfare of the people. Well, in this information age, when there is so much of explosion of information, so much information through print media, through electronic media, through the social media platforms is being put in the public domain. Half of it may be true, half of it may not be true at times. There is so much of falsehood at times, and sometimes the reporting also gets clouded by the political leanings of the journalists or by the people who put all kinds of facts and the information on the on the internet or in the media or even in the press. And even the reader at times, they also are biased in drawing the inferences based on the information which is made available to them, because sometimes their own political leanings also cloud their judgment and the inferences they draw. So we are living in some, on the one hand, you have this imperative of, ensuring that the press is free, but at the same time, how do you arrest the spread of the falsehood or the half truth in the public domain? So these are the challenges, before not only the governments but for the people of this country. Just to mention something which is, I think most of you are aware of, that during this COVID period, depending on which political ideology you belong to. There were accusations, counter accusations by the state governments against the center. Likewise, the central government also said something about the state governments. The people believed one side of the story or the other. So, you know, at times the truth becomes the casualty. So as an individual citizen of this country, I think it's a huge responsibility, you know, on our shoulders, that we must be vigilant. We must be vigilant and try to see to it that not only that we observe the ethical behavior on our part, well, because these days every individual is behaving like a journalist, you know. Then the moment you put some information on the internet or you know, your opinion in the press, you yourself as an individual, you have to do some soul searching. You have to do some introspection, whether you are doing the right thing, you are putting the right information in the public domain. So it's as much the responsibility of the journalists, it is the responsibility of us as individuals also to ensure that certain ethical norms, ethical behavior is adhered to. Just a couple of days back, I was listening to some program, I think it was BBC World. There the political parties, in fact, are contemplating putting in, or you know, a legislation, coming up with a legislation for financial and criminal penalties for spreading any misinformation or any falsehood about the COVID situation, including the rollout of the vaccine. In fact, there is a lot of concern in UK about the you know, eventual efficacy of the rollout of vaccine as and when the vaccine is made available. Because there are all sorts of information right now about these vaccines, or for that matter, any alternate cure related to COVID. So it is important that in our country also, that we do have some legislation which prescribes certain penalties for some falsehood or for some misinformation which may be put in the public domain. So with these words, I wish to listen to Paneerselvan Saab and Madam Joseph. I'm told that these two are, you know, very well established and very famous journalists, and so I'm looking forward to their speeches, and hopefully I would get educated myself a bit. So thank you, Joya ji and Sunil Behra Saab and Anjuman Bora and Abhijit Bora Saab for inviting me to this event. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, that you could find time and be here with us, sir. It's a great inspiration. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. Such perceptive words by a keen observer of how the media functions. And thank you so much also for pointing out the importance of how the audience have a role to be vigilant in circumstances like these. Thank you, sir. And now it is time for the most awaited segment of today's program, the invited talks by our guest speakers. So first of all, I would like to invite Mr. A.S. Paneerselvan to deliver his talk. Mr. Paneerselvan is the reader's editor with The Hindu, the first newspaper in the history of Indian journalism to appoint a reader's editor, an independent, full-time internal ombudsman of the newspaper. As the reader's editor, Mr. Paneerselvan has been instrumental in guiding The Hindu in practicing self-regulation, accountability, and transparency, and improving accuracy, verification, and standards in the newspaper. Apart from his role in The Hindu, Mr. Paneerselvan also has been closely associated with PANOS South Asia Executive Director. He is a steering committee member of the Global Forum for Media Development and an advisory panel member of the Knight International Journalism Fellowship program administered by the International Center for Journalists. Mr. Paneerselvan has previously worked with the Sun Network and the Outlook magazine. He has published more than 200 articles in various national and international publications. He has also directed a film titled Making Trouble Where There Is None. Mr. Paneerselvan, apart from being a regular columnist, is also a journalism teacher and is an adjunct faculty member of the prestigious Asian College of Journalism, Chennai. He has presented more than 20 major papers on the question of devolution in various national and international seminars. Today, Mr. Paneerselvan will speak on the topic, Maintaining Journalistic Integrity, View from the Other Side. I hand over to you, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes,
Okay.
sir, you're
Thank you very much for inviting me. I am slightly discomforted about this idea of addressing that ethical deficit as if it is happening only today. Ethical deficit predated COVID. COVID made our life much more difficult, but some of the deficits what we are facing predates COVID. Therefore, what we have to keep in our mind is we can't use COVID as one hold all into which we can put all our problems into it. And some of the problems we have actually inherited over the last 25, 30 years. I think it's very, very important to keep that in mind, that the ethical challenges what we are facing is a legacy issue of nearly 3 decades. That's point number one. Point number two is some of the words which we are using today are not actually helping journalism. For instance, one word which is not at all helping journalism is multitasking. Multitasking is a euphemism to exploit somebody to do more. It is not actually helping somebody to do a lot of things. Primarily because that's how the newspaper here and the media economics is working today. The idea of financial strain in the industry has given rise to quite a lot of new interesting words. And some of these interesting words are not actually helping the newsroom. The essential element of the newsroom was the warmth, where you can walk to your senior and get some idea of mentoring and also some idea of comfort. But this multitasking does not permit those things to happen. Imagine I have to file a story, I have to tweet about it, I have to give an Instagram feed about it, and then I have to make a short clip and promote it. Am I going to think about my story, or I am going to think about all the paraphernalia? I entered journalism when there was only one deadline, and it was really easy. Today, youngsters whom studying from our colleges and who are getting to the profession, having an hourly deadline. They have to update the story every hour, which means nearly half an hour they spend on updating the story, which means they have a fragmented half an hour to understand the story, to do the research, to interact with everybody. Essentially, what is happening is the amount of pressure what we are transferring onto the young journalists is very, very high. Therefore, compare this luxury of having one deadline and having about 14 deadlines a day and 14 deadlines across platforms. They have to tweet, they have to promote, they have to do something for the print edition, something for the web edition. At some level, deep inside, some of the market-generated words and terminologies need to be unpacked. Therefore, that is one issue about which we do not talk when we talk about the ethical deficiency within the industry. It's very easy to point out the obvious errors, like say paid news. It's obvious, and we can easily point out. We can talk about the misanthropy in the media. We can talk about misogyny in media. We can talk about gender injustice in media. But these things which are slightly obvious and which have been linked to a larger struggle. When we are talking about gender injustice within media, we also understand that the feminist movement is there for 40, 50 years. Therefore, there's a collective idea from the society which helps us to understand these deficiencies. But certain deficiencies which you are not able to locate are the ones which are industry specific. And the industry specific one, first is multitasking, and second is the lack of domain expertise, which has been encouraged in the name of cost cutting. This, I think, I want to develop a bit longer, because I am to use the example which I know very well. For instance, in my newspaper, we had a rural affairs editor, we had a banking editor, we had a macroeconomic editor, not long ago, till recently. But when these people retired, there is no replacement. After C. Ramanohar Reddy left the paper, we don't have a macroeconomic editor. And after Sainath left, we don't have a rural affairs editor. After Mr. C.R.L. Narasimhan left, we don't have a banking editor. For all these sectors, if you want to know some expert ideas, we go back to the people who are from the sector itself. The problem is there is no critical distance between your evaluation and you being part of the industry. We had a huge diplomatic team which could analyze, but now if you need anything to do with diplomacy, you go to a former ambassador to write on it. We had a huge team of cricket writers. Now if you want to know about cricket, you go to a former test player. If you want to know about tennis, you go to a former tennis player. Therefore, the investment in domain expertise is coming down drastically. And that is going to have a much bigger impact. That is also an important and integral part of maintaining ethical standards within the newspaper. Remember when Mr. Ramanohar Reddy was handling macroeconomic affairs, he is not trying to become a job applicant to become the advisor to the governor or to the government. Our diplomatic writers were never looking to become an ambassador to some country. Our cricket writer was not trying to become the BCCI trainer. Our banking editor was not trying to find a job as a board member of one of the banks. Therefore, there was a domain expertise and a critical distance. Today, what is happening is by not investing enough on our domain expertise, we are reducing this critical distance and it is hurting. So, to me, the obvious problems with the media ethics, starting from the paid news, conflict of interest between advertising and editorial, all those things have been fairly well documented, because 77, what we consider as a cutoff year for the post-emergency Indian journalism, since then we know what all happened, and these have been fairly well documented. Sukumar Muralidharan's book has certain very important elements. Amu Joseph, who's going to speak after me, she and Kalpana Sharma had documented a lot. And there were these issues which have been documented. I think now we have to move towards another situation of the invisible barriers for good journalism. The invisible barriers are the one which is actually technology-driven one, which is essentially flowing from the power of Silicon Valley. Till 2011 or even 2012, we were using the word called digital empowerment. And from 2012, we are using the word called digital disruption. How did this change happen? This change happens with the consolidation of the platform companies. It can be your Google, it can be your Twitter, it can be your Facebook, it can be the Cambridge Analytica, which is harvesting all these data, or they can get into various aspects. I'm not going to get into filter bubble or confirmation bias. These are the two issues which are directly linked with this, but it also talks about from a multinodal decentralized imagination of web. It is becoming an extremely centralized entity. And the centralization of the web gives more power not to the citizens, but it gives more power to the nation states. If a nation states can switch on and switch off. Even in some of the decisions the newspapers and the media organization took between 2008 and 2012 are hurting them more now. Because that was a time when they all thought reach is more important, and if we have the reach, revenue will follow. If you would have talked to any of the media managers around at that time, they will be talking about the reach. Oh, the social media gives this much of reach. Oh, that Twitter gives that much of. Well, reach over revenue was the formula which was followed at that point of time. But later, that entire reach turned into revenue for the platform companies. This is the one which is actually hurting them, and they don't know how to negotiate this. If they pull out now, their reach will fall. And if the reach falls, even the little revenue what they get will fall. But if they are going to sustain the same level of reach, they are not having a break-even revenue stream as of now. It's a classic catch-22 situation into which various media managers have walked in. And when the interesting aspect is, media managers did not consult journalists when they took these decisions. They felt that they know the business. The fundamental element is there's a difference between media industry and journalism. Journalism looks at issues as public good, and media industries look at something as sustainable. Therefore, the idea of sustainable and public good was earlier neatly wedded to each other because we know clearly what were the revenue streams. We knew that this is the money we are going to get from advertising. This is the money we are going to get from circulation. And we also knew, that helped us to also draw quite a lot of perimeters around us. We said that you can't breach these lines. But the moment this model has been changed, we are yet to come up with a new set of perimeters. That is the most important one, what we have to realize. Because how are these stories getting? If you are going to get an alert through an encrypted messenger, say like WhatsApp, are you going to take it seriously or are you going to ignore it? As a journalist, your fundamental instinct is not to ignore it. But as a journalist, you are also aware of the fact that quite a lot of vested interests are using this encrypted messaging software in a very, very effective manner. And we don't have a proper filter to decide which to follow up and which to ignore. And sometimes when you start following it up, it becomes a wild goose chase. And the things which have ended up as wild goose chase are the ones which have been finely crafted by the IT wings of some of the political parties. And these IT wings of the political parties are now intercontinental operations. Therefore, by the time your newspaper goes to the bed, it becomes the daytime for them. And they work out all their attacks. And by the time you come to the office, the litany of complaints against your publication, against your writers, against your journalists are there. The way it's a very, very complex reality which we are trying to negotiate. Earlier, if you're closely looking at the history of media, intervention of the technology actually helped media to grow in a positive sense. When print moved from hand composing to lino, it shortened the deadline. And when radio came in, it reached more people. And when television came in, feature section of the newspaper became better. But generally, a new technology's intervention helps media to grow in a positive way. And initially, when internet happened, it actually helped media. And in fact, internet was seen as a site of public good, and newspapers were seen as a site of private profitship. How did newspaper from being site of private profit had become the site of public good, and how did net, which was seen as a site of public good, had become pure profit center for Silicon Valley giant? Quite a lot of issues lie in that shift. And that shift happened in the last decade. The way it was happening in front of us, while we know that the shift is happening, we do not have a language or a technique to keep them at a bay. We know the role of Facebook, or both in Brexit as well as in the US elections, which have been much more well documented, and to some extent the role of the Facebook and Twitter in forcing the Northeast students to leave Bangalore and Chennai when there was an attack on the Northeast students here. But beyond this, in India, we haven't done a systematic study on these platforms. The advantage between the US media and the Indian, what the US media has over the other media is that they have a systematic academic study on these issues. Therefore, Emily Bell, who heads the digital journalism program at Columbia Journalism School, she's an outstanding journalist in her own right, but she has also done quite a lot of empirical study on these impacts. And the algorithm driven discrimination is a new big problem for all of us. What is the problem here? You may ask if you're in a distance, but since I sit within the newspaper office and I interact with the editors on a regular basis, they say that this algorithm develops trends on a constant basis, and you cannot afford not to cover the trend. Therefore, the trend might be completely a superfluous trend. But how can you not afford to cover it if that is going to be trending for nearly 1.5 days? Therefore, this tyranny of algorithm, which has entered the newsroom, I was completely oblivious of all these things when we entered our journalism. Our news editors said, don't worry whether the paper sells or not. We were kept completely insulated from all these things. But you remember a young reporter who's joining the profession today. First thing that young journalist is being exposed to or series of metrics. These metrics, which are quantitative in their approach, have zero qualitative attributes attached to it. That's what we have to keep in mind. That is where the entire tension starts. Unless and otherwise we are able to bring in some sort of a qualitative attributes to these metrics, I will tell you the difference. For instance, Sukumar Muralidharan, a friend of ours, wrote a piece on a day in which Chetan Bhagat wrote a piece in Times of India. Chetan Bhagat's piece apparently got some 25 times or 30 times more than Sukumar Muralidharan's total hit for the entire day in an hour. And earlier, before the days of metrics, I would not have even known that these two are comparable. I knew that I can read Sukumar and I can't read Chetan Bhagat. That was my simple position. Because you read to know, you don't read to waste your time. The tyranny of metrics, the types of analytics which have entered the newsroom are also a new form of ethical pressures. At some level, what we are doing is that, okay, we are going to lose out on all these numbers. If we can survive, let's survive. That is a position taken by quite a lot of people who are doing fairly decent journalism today. If you go and talk to them, they are doing it under severe strain. It can be a web-based interventions, or it can be a print plus web combination, which some of them are doing. Therefore, the platform here, the device or the platform is not the issue. Issue is, if you're with public interest journalism, what are the pressures? That is the first question. And people who use what public is interested in seems to be drowning out the public interest journalism. See, what public is interested in is always an integral part of journalism. But there was a fine balance. No editor permitted what public is interested in to drown out the public interest in journalism. But today I can completely ignore public interest and cater only to what public is interested in. And I can justify it showing host of numbers. It can be the hit rate, it can be the page views, it can be the unique visitors. There are any number of these metrics which is going on. That is the issue. Now, for a different essay, I was looking at the first two press council commission's reports. In the first two press commission's reports, there is no space for metrics. It was looking at whether you are able to deliver something to enable people. Therefore, the fundamental issue is the enabling ability of journalism. From the enabling ability of the journalism to what we have today, which is everything is being measured only in terms of reach, is extremely disturbing. And this reach is not editorially driven. This reach is essentially driven by markets, which means market also brings in something called an aesthetic filter. However, market is not going to deal with, say, a deprivation in a tribal area, because you're not going to sell any product there. Therefore, it will be talking about the problem in Bombay apartments. Then it works. Therefore, the problem with these numbers is that these numbers literally filter out other segments, and it concentrates on SEC-A and SEC-B. That is the socioeconomic category A and socioeconomic category B, because these two bring in advertising and the C and D don't bring in advertising. Therefore, the explosion which happens internally is now much more disturbing. And this exclusion also comes with the idea of it links to the revenue, it links to sustainability, it links to your profitability. Everything has been tied to it. Now imagine somebody wants to do a story on extreme poverty in certain parts of Orissa. Nobody is going to send the two correspondents. And also look at this metrics-driven journalism. Metrics-driven journalism has given so much of revenue for the primetime television, where there is very little reportage. And reportage costs money. Now just imagine, remove that 1.5 hours from Republic TV and put 1.5 hours of hard reporting on a particular subject. That's going to cost money. Say even Ladakh, if you want to cover it, you have to send 2 journalists there. They will go with the cameraman, then they have to upload that images. All those things are going to cost money. But if you are going to get 4 people into your studio and ask them to shout at each other, the biggest issue, what we witness is that there is a change in the way the news gathering expenditure has been done. It has been completely reworked. And there is a reduction, approximate reduction is between 60% to 75%. Versus the television where the reduction is 75%. And in the mainstream big print papers, the reduction is to up till 20 to 25%. When you're talking about maintaining ethical journalism, we can't talk about it in a vacuum. We have to understand the context in which journalists work. Journalists have to travel, which means there should be adequate news gathering expenditure. And journalists also, if they are doing a long form reportage, they need the time. The way you can't expect your journalists to updating your story every hour. The updating story every hour removes the idea called immersive journalism. Immersive journalism means actually you spend some time interviewing a person. It takes at least 20 to 25 minutes to win the confidence of the person. See, I have covered some of the most disturbing developments after 84. In these specific cases, we permitted the person to get comfortable with our presence, then they start opening out. But if I'm expected to put out a tweet every 1 hour and an update every 2 hours, what am I going to ask? I'm going to shove the mic and say, what do you think? And that person will say, you get lost. But they generally, they don't do it. The people are much more kinder than what media is to the people, to people. That's a different story altogether. But on the whole, the idea of immersive journalism is getting hit because of this multiple deadlines. And we don't know how to regulate it. I'm not talking about one media house or the other. I'm talking about mainstream media as a unit is struggling to come up with a language to deal with this. At the same time, all the alternative efforts have taken so much of energy, so much of investment, and none of them are really sustainable. Quite a few of friends are trying to do something which is different from these models, but they all are struggling. Whether it is for-profit model or for not-for-profit model, none of them are finding it easy to sustain. But what we are witnessing today is that there is a will to produce something better. There is a will to be accountable. There is a will to produce in-depth work. And there is very little institutional support for these initiatives. See, when B.G. Varghese committee's recommendation was converted finally into Prasar Bharati in 1997, we thought that that is going to open up a space for some sort of a public interest journalism in India. But today what we are witnessing is that Prasar Bharati is worse than BJP's IT cell. What we are witnessing is that the state, everything seems to become a state media. That critical distance between the state media and what we report is vanishing. And to make the matters worse, the most credible public interest media, BBC, is under severe strain. And if the conservatives in UK are going to have their way, BBC's funding might be hit in the next license fee arrangement. How are we going to look at this? Where is the funding for public interest journalism is going to come? How are we going to tell an average reader or an average viewer that you are spending a lot for your media consumption, you are spending for your DTH, you are spending for your broadband connections, which means you are willing to give money to Airtel or Jio, you are willing to give money to Tata Sky or to Z Direct, which means you are willing to give money to the carrier, but you are not giving any money to the content. Content should be free, but carriers can charge anything. Look at the way the carriers have upped the price over the last 4 years. Look at the money, the change of fee structure of even streaming services. The moment it reaches the critical viewership, they keep revising the prices. And the content one is under severe pressure. Therefore, it's a combination of factors which is putting in so much of pressure. And these factors, we cannot shift onto COVID alone. COVID is just one additional pressure on us. I think I should stop here and then take questions because I think I've spoken a lot. And sorry if I'm sounding a bit grim, but I do not want to give you any false prognosis of the industry.
No, sir, that's right. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Paneerselvan. I think the way you have, critically analyzed and dissected the whole circumstances under which the media, industry and the profession itself is working. I would not say industry, rather profession is working, and how the market-driven, the technology-driven, the matrix-driven, the multiple deadline-driven journalism is actually kind of, sounded the death knell for ethical journalism and for public interest journalism. It sounds grim, but definitely it is true, and it's important that we see how we can create a way out of this situation. We will have questions at the end of the session, so I would request everyone to park their thoughts, and you can all type in your questions in the chat box for our speakers to take at the end of the session. Now, I would like to invite our next speaker, Madam Ammu Joseph, to deliver her talk. Madam Joseph is an independent journalist and author based in Bangalore, writing primarily on issues relating to gender, human development, and the media. With degrees in English literature and public communications, she began her career with Eve's Weekly in Mumbai in 1977. In her last full-time job within the press, she was editor of the Sunday magazine of the Indian Post, Mumbai. She currently writes for a number of mainstream publications and web-based media. Among her publications are 6 solely authored books, and she has been associated with numerous other national and international publications in various capacities. She was South Asia coordinator of the IWMF's Global Research on Women in the News Media and India coordinator of the Global Media Monitoring Project. She contributed to UNESCO's Gender Sensitive Indicators for Media, World Trends in the State of Freedom of Expression and Media Development, and Reshaping Cultural Policies. She received the UNFPA Lardli Media Award for Gender Sensitivity in 2007 in recognition of her consistent engagement with gender issues. In 2003, she received the Donna Allen Award for Feminist Advocacy from the Association of Educators in Journalism and Mass Communication, USA. She has been on the visiting faculty of several institutions of media education and is a founder member of the network of Women in Media India and Media Watch Bangalore. Thank you so much for joining us, ma'am. It's a privilege to have you. I would now like to hand it over to you for your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Sorry, I would like to announce that the title for Madam Joseph's talk today is The Media, Pandemic and Co-Morbidities.
Good afternoon and warm greetings on Bhai Dooj, which I understand is a state public holiday in Assam. So it's quite surprising that so many people are have tuned into this event. And of course, National Press Freedom Day 2020. You know, I must tell you that I can't see myself, so I have no idea what context, you know, like the context in which I can't see myself on screen at all. But before I begin my formal presentation, I would like to thank the Department of Mass Communication and Journalism, Tezpur University, and Professor Abhijit Bora in particular for inviting me to be part of this event. Contrary to what the head of the department said earlier, I have actually been to Tezpur University, and I still have wonderful memories of being at the university in person for a workshop on women and media way back in 2008. I'd also like to thank Paneerselvam for a very interesting and enlightening description of the situation prevailing in the news media today. I mean, it's a very thought-provoking talk that he just gave. Professor Bora suggested that I focus on journalism in the current circumstances, the pandemic and other related issues. So that's why I titled this talk, The Media Pandemic and Co-Morbidities, using words that have become an integral part of our lexicon over the past several months. As you know, 16 November was chosen as India's Press Freedom Day because it was apparently on this day in 1966 that the Press Council of India was established. I must admit that I have actually been quite critical of the PCI and its role in preserving the freedom of the press, maintaining and improving the standards of newspapers, and helping to develop a code of conduct for newspapers and journalists in India, which is what it was set up for. I do believe it has not been as effective an institution as it could and should have been, has been conspicuously silent on a number of critical issues relating to the press, and has taken controversial, to put it diplomatically, positions on a number of important matters, such as the paid news phenomenon, when it actually tried to suppress a detailed report on the subject by a committee it set up, comprising 2 of its own members. And of course, more recently, its attempt to intervene in a writ petition against this, filed in the Supreme Court by Anuradha Bhasin, executive editor of Kashmir Times, against the severe government-imposed restrictions on communication in Jammu and Kashmir from August 2019 onwards. And I had written about the role of the Press Council in that case as an edit page piece in the Deccan Herald last year. From time to time, I've also pointed out the unrepresentative composition of the PCI's members. A quick look at the list today revealed, for example, that there are just 2 women among the 18 members of the current 13th term, and neither of them is a media professional or manager or owner. There also doesn't appear to be adequate regional representation. For example, I did not spot a single member from any of the northeastern states. However, to give credit where it is due, I am pleased to see that the PCI has of late taken so much notice of the retrenchment of at least some of the hundreds of journalists working for a wide range of publications over the past several months, as well as the non-payment of salaries by at least one newspaper company. That brings me to the first issue I would like to highlight as one of the comorbidities of the media during the pandemic-induced crisis we have witnessed since April this year. The job loss suffered by hundreds, maybe even a few thousands of journalists, and the income insecurity faced by thousands of others as salaries were cut or not paid at all. While it is commendable that the PCI has taken suo motu notice of at least some of these developments, it is actually shocking to me that it has not taken a lead in documenting the phenomenon so that there is a credible estimate of how many media professionals have been affected. It is totally unacceptable that the only attempt of such documentation that I know of is by Cyril Sam, a journalist based in Delhi, who has compiled a crowdsourced list up to August 2020. I understand that media houses have also been hurting financially thanks to the economic slowdown that certainly preceded the pandemic, but was exacerbated by it, and especially the severe extended lockdown from March to May, and that they are still on shaky ground, and that is what the reason they have been giving for having had to lay off so many of their staff. But this is another phenomenon that the PCI ought to be actively looking into, since the financial health of media houses is closely connected to their ability to be independent. In this context, in my opinion, the PCI also ought to have been examining allegations regarding the punitive withholding of advertisements to media houses that have annoyed the powers that be with their investigative journalism, and of course, cases filed against many of them as well. Clearly, media outlets that are in dire straits financially are not likely to be in a position to uphold the freedom of the press, let alone maintain and improve journalistic ethics and standards. The PCI also does not appear to have taken public note of India's downslide in the Reporters Without Borders annual press freedom barometer. In 2020, as you may know, India found itself at the 142nd position among 180 countries in the world rankings, down 2 points from the previous year. In a June 2020 report titled India, Media's Crackdown During COVID-19 Lockdown, the Rights and Risks Analysis Group has stated that about 55 journalists faced arrest, registration of FIRs, summons or show cause notices, physical assault, alleged destruction of property, and threats for reporting on COVID-19 or for exercising freedom of opinion and expression during the national lockdown from March to May. The highest number of attacks against media persons was reported from Uttar Pradesh, 11 journalists, followed by Jammu and Kashmir, 6 journalists. In the northeastern region, Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, and Nagaland evidently had one such case each. The Guardian also carried a report on this in July 2020, headlined India Arrests Dozens of Journalists in Clampdown on Critics of COVID-19 Response. A study commissioned by the Thakur Family Foundation on attacks on journalists in India, released in December 2019, recorded nearly 200 serious instances and 40 killings in the 5 years since 2014. According to the report, of these 40 deaths, 21 were directly linked to journalists' professional work, and there had been only 3 convictions in journalist murder cases since 2010. At least 2 murders of journalists have been reported in India in 2020, in Tamil Nadu and Uttar Pradesh. And as you no doubt know, questions have been raised about the recent death of senior journalist Parag Bhuyan of Pratidin Time in Assam. I have not seen any reaction from the PCI to the controversy over the recent speedy grant of bail to Arnab Goswami, who I'm aware is a son of Assam, in a case unrelated to journalism, especially in contrast to the judicial treatment of the many other journalists who have languished in jail for prolonged periods on what many believe to be dubious charges. Among recent examples are Siddiqui Kappan and Prashant Kanodia in UP, and Kishore Chandra Wangkim in Manipur. I have yet to hear what the PCI has to say about the recent order by the union government bringing online news portals and content providers, including OTT platforms like Netflix and Amazon, under the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. But perhaps this is because its jurisdiction is restricted to print media and doesn't encompass digital news media, though I suspect that is because the latter did not exist in 1966, so it was not written into its mandate. In the COVID context, I would also like to point out that the PCI does not appear to have taken into account of or documented the large number of journalists who have tested positive over the past several months, at least partly because they have not been provided with adequate safety training or equipment. Three news reports have a few numbers: 53 in Mumbai in April, 23 in Hyderabad on one day, 14 June, 3 in Delhi, and so on. But somebody ought to be documenting this, and I can't think of any better institution than the PCI. I sincerely believe that if the PCI is to continue to be contemporary and relevant, it needs to seriously re-examine its role in promoting freedom of expression, which includes the safety and security of journalists and the sustainability of news organizations, as well as ethics and standards in news media, especially newspapers. In my opinion, it needs to reinvent itself as a more proactive institution, not one that merely adjudicates cases specifically brought to its attention. And I might add that the procedure for bringing anything to its attention is a very tedious one. Before I end, I would like to bring to your attention a new report titled "The Missing Perspectives of Women in COVID-19 News," a special report on women's underrepresentation in news media. It was commissioned by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The study is based on examined women's representation in COVID-19 news gathering and news coverage in several parts of the world, which includes India, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, the UK, and the US. Expectedly, the report uncovers a substantial bias towards men's perspectives in both news gathering and news coverage of the pandemic across all the regions covered by the survey. According to the report, this bias operates against a backdrop of women's political underrepresentation in the COVID-19 response in these countries, as well as the unique socioeconomic, health, and psychological challenges that women face globally. The absence of women's perspectives in COVID-19 related news coverage means that women have limited influence over the framing of the crisis in the news, and consequently, limited influence over policy decisions. As a result, women are at ever greater risk of being further marginalized amid the most significant global health crisis of our lifetime. For example, the gender breakdown of leading figures in COVID-19 headlines revealed that in India, women constituted only 19% of such figures, while men made up 77%. The remaining headlines presumably did not include any such leading figure. If any of you are interested, and I hope at least some of you are, the report is available on the website of the International Women's Media Foundation. The Network of Women in Media is undertaking a study as well of the Indian media more extensively, including regional language media, etc. I think I'll end now, wishing all of you a safe passage into the post-COVID world that I'm sure all of us are longing for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam, for this talk where you have really talked about how the PCI needs to reinvent itself and rethink of its role in performing its mandated functions of standing up for press freedom, and how this can actually create, really change the things, how it's working in the media in the current times, especially during the COVID situation, which has created a new kind of crisis for media, adding to the already existing ones. So thank you so much, ma'am. And now I would like to open up the house for Q&A. We already have a few questions in the chat box. We will start off with those. And in the meantime, I request the others to also put in their questions. So I will start off by putting in the first question. Yes, this is from Mr. Swaminathan Sinu. The question is, in today's pandemic age, where media industry is finding it hard to sustain itself, is it practical or possible for having expertise-based writers in media enterprises, which Mr. Paneerselvan sir has said? So I would request Mr. Paneerselvan to kindly address this question.
See, the problem is, if you are going to look purely on economic terms, it may not be possible today. But if you're looking at the role of media, what I'm saying is we may not be able to restore all the domain expertise, at least one or two. See, the thing is, when I talked about it, I did not talk about one. I'm talking about a range of issues which we lost. For instance, there used to be a huge labor beat in most of the media. And the present generation reporters have no idea of something called the labor beat. I think apart from the Somesh Jha's series of articles in Business Standard, we haven't seen any substantial report on the status of Indian labor today. And Somesh Jha's pieces are only in Business Standard, which means business newspapers are not general publications. They are already within a specialized area. And within the specialized area, if you are behind the paywall, you become much more limited in your reach. And it's so important for us to realize, when I talked about the domain expertise, it's a range of domain expertise. What Somesh Jha is doing in his reports in Business Standard used to be a regular feature with all the newspapers. Hindu, Express, Deccan Herald, Tribune, all of them used to have a labor beat. Human rights was a common word. That word has suddenly disappeared from the media. When I'm talking about all these things, it's not about the money. It's about our intention of being public good or our intention of being the amplifier of the people in power. If I want to become a megaphone for those in power, then it's easy. I need not have to spend money. But if I want to be a person who is providing critical inputs to my readers or to my viewers, as I said, we may not have enough money to recreate all the domain expertise positions, but at least consciously, depending on the states or depending on the cities, we should be able to think and retrieve 1 or 2 positions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Dr. S.R. Sanjeev. This question is also to Mr. Paneerselvan. The question is, what do you think of efforts of some governments, for instance, Australia, to make Facebook, Google, etc., to pay for the content? Is it possible to have an alliance in similar lines in India to transform legacy media houses as credible sources of information, even in cyberspace?
This entire idea of regulating the electronic media, it started in the Europe, and what the Australia has brought out is a pale version of the European model. At least in the European model, they are also coming up with a very clear financial recompensation for the original content producer. Whereas in the Australian model, that financial recompense part is not there. But even with the financial recompense model of the Europe, we are not able to really handle these issues. Because if you have to handle it, there is only one way, which is called censorship. And censorship filtering is not good. And if we have decided not to follow the censorship filtering, and what is the legal action can you take? It's a company which is registered in California. I can't go and fight a case in Madras or in Bangalore and think that I'm going to win. The way the decentralized and diffused structure of the internet is posing a completely different issue. I don't think we have the latest development from Government of India on that OTT is the most disturbing one. Actually, day before yesterday, Shashi Kumar wrote a very fine op-ed piece on that OTT regulation, what Ravi Shankar Prasad and his team have conceived. The idea is the governments in most of the countries confuse regulation with censorship. Unless and otherwise, we have an enlightened government which makes a clear distinction between regulation and censorship. We might be actually having more censorship than proper regulation. If it needs an amount of reflection, and in that process of reflection, we also need senior media players to be present there. It needs a question of voice. When we are talking about voice, I can't say that I can talk on behalf of women because I am sensitive to those issues. I can't say that I'm going to talk on behalf of Dalits and tribals because I'm sensitive to that. We should have the humility to give space for their voices. It starts from the question of having voice. And if you're looking at the new regulatory framework, the idea of voice is completely absent. The idea of voice is absent, that regulatory framework essentially ends up as a censorship framework, which is much more damaging than the faulty media environment in which we are living. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I hope that answers Mr. Sanjeev's question. Now we have another question by Lalrui Luanga. I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. The question is, why is Northeast problem always missed out in the big media? Hence, when published, the fake news runs a lot. Can anyone talk about this as part of being a mass communication community? I think Madam Joseph can probably take this question.
Well, I think this is a perennial problem, and we have, in fact, we've heard about it for a very long time. But the time that many of us actually experienced how bad the situation is, was in, I think it was 2009 when the network's annual meeting was in Imphal. And about 60 of us landed from different parts of the country in Imphal airport, having no idea that the city was under curfew and had been for 3 weeks. And we were all journalists. We follow the news in the media available to us, but we had no idea that the place we were going to and our colleagues in Imphal deliberately didn't tell us, so that we could experience for ourselves how little the so-called mainstream mainland media cover. And in fact, many of us then wrote about it. And in fact, even that was such a problem, because we happened to be there when Irom Sharmila was released, as she was every year. And so we went to witness that and talk to her, etc. And so one of our colleagues messaged their editor in NDTV and said, I'd like to do a story about this. So that editor said, oh, but she's released every year, so what's the big news in that? So we were reminded about Sainath's thing, saying that the India Fashion Week happens every year, but you still cover it, right? So so it is a big struggle, and I think even journalists who would like to cover the Northeast, whether based in the Northeast or going in, which I know that's also a controversial thing when journalists from other places go and as parachute journalists and all that kind of thing. There's a lot of controversy about that, but it is an uphill struggle. But I can only think of it as the same kind of situation as when international media covers India, only when there's a disaster or a terrorist attack or some major calamity happens, and that's when the media in the West tends to focus on India. At least traditionally, that used to be the case, and it's a similar situation. And I think I have no solution to that except to keep on emphasizing the need to cover the whole of the country. I mean, I think while people in northeastern states are perfectly justified in feeling this, I must tell you that if you are from Kerala, you would realize that Kerala is hardly ever covered in the national news either. In fact, the emphasis on Delhi and surrounding areas is very evident to everybody, So I think it's all relative. While I agree that the Northeast gets the shortest end of the stick, there are many other parts of India also which are not adequately covered unless something major like floods or earthquake or something like that happens.
Thank you, ma'am. There is another question directed at Madam Joseph. This is about the recent order to regulate OTTs under the INP ministry. This issue has already been addressed by Mr. Paneer Selvan, but however, I would still want to have Madam Joseph's thoughts on this. So this is a question from Nirupal Tinsena, and he asked that what do you think how the independent creators who only rely on OTTs will get to maintain their creative freedom? Moreover, we've seen in the past how the CBFC has censored visual arts. So, Madam, kindly share your thoughts on this as
well. This is certainly not an area that I know much about, so I can only guess at what the impact will be. But I do think independent creators who have of late at least found OTT platforms providing them with some opportunities are likely to find more restrictions. And I think it's part of the, it's part of the restrictions that everybody is facing. I mean, documentary filmmakers, for example, have faced it forever. And especially anybody making films on so-called sensitive subjects. It's really very difficult. Everybody must be knowing about Anand Patwardhan's, sort of struggles over the years to get his film screened on Doordarshan. I mean, he took the trouble to actually take those cases to court and win judgment. But many other documentary filmmakers don't have that kind of staying power, and therefore, have to be content with having to, having smaller audiences for their films, and which makes it all the more difficult for them to raise funds. And I think the OTT platforms, in a way, had opened up the space for both fiction and non-fiction people who and I have apprehensions that this the Information and Broadcasting Ministry taking it over that it is not good news for them.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. This is a question to Mr. Paneerselvan again. Regarding your stance on lack of institutional support to journalism, do you think the business unit of this sector has failed collectively to pitch for the right worth for the content they provide? This is from Akanksha, a student of Tezpur University.
See, at some level, it's the changes which took place at a much faster pace than anybody could imagine. I have to tell you one interesting story where the INS president, INS is the Indian Newspaper Society, its president attended the Van Infra conference, and they asked him about the digital disruption and what is happening to what will happen to the Indian media. The INS president said that Indian media is like sun, and even media is like sun. It rises in the east and it is setting in the west. And he thought that this crisis is going to catch up with us only by 2040. And this, he said it in 2008. There were at some level, these changes had come much faster, and these people were not really prepared. That is the most important one. We have to keep that in mind. Till 2008, they thought that it's going to hit them much later. And the deadline they had in their mind was 2040. But the deadline came to them by 2013. That was first. And second thing, which is most important element, is that the business unit of the publications, wherever it is, not just in India, even in the US, never got it right. They forced most of the independent newspapers in the US to get listed. And the moment they got listed, the biggest focus on them was to ensure return on investment. And this pressure on the bottom line literally killed the media. Therefore, the business model per se for this sector has to be completely different. This business model cannot have a constant increase in the return on investment. That growth which happens in other sectors, you cannot have it here. And that is what the listing of the American companies, American newspaper companies tell us. That almost all the newspaper companies which went for listing have gone now. And the companies which are holding up are with the private ownership. Because private ownership has a different stake with the media. They want a respectability in their society. They want to be an influencer in the society. So profit is just one element. It's a complex one, and I don't think we will be able to answer it with proper explanation within the limited time. But to put all the blame on the business unit of the media alone is not right. Our editors were not prepared. They thought that they are going to be there in the same format is going to continue for long. It's not that as if journalists understood all the changes which are taking place. We journalists were unable to really understand the type of specialization which can be hidden in some of the blogs. Some of the blogs are very, very good. Just because of there's so much of venom in the cyberspace, we cannot ignore the amount of scholarship within the cyberspace also. What we need is a proper filtering of pulling out the best of the cyberspace and keeping the toxic nature of the cyberspace at the bay. Therefore, we need a intelligent filtering of this issue. And that intelligent filtering might happen with a collective effort. If, some of you people like from the university should come together. AMU and a Network for Women in Media in India should come together. All of us have to sit together and see that whether we can come up with a collective filtering. When I was talking about the toxicity of the net, I am 100% aware of some of the profound work which is happening in the net. Some of the in-depth individual efforts which are taking place in the net. Even something like, say, the India Forum, which is run by Ram Reddy, is a very good initiative. People like Anuradha Bhasin, when she started writing after the internet lockdown in Kashmir, it was a very, very important intervention. Therefore, these interventions are happening in the cyberspace. Only thing is this algorithm-driven traffic doesn't pull out these important interventions. It pulls out the frivolous interventions first. Therefore, if we are able to make that distinction between frivolous intervention and the insightful intervention, and if we are able to recast this arrangement somehow, I don't know how, because I'm not a technocrat, I don't know how to code all these things, but a collective version, at least what I can do is, I can identify some of the best things which are happening. Now, how to sell this idea of best practices and make it as the fundamental benchmark through which information should come into the public sphere, then we might be able to do it. But I think it is completely wrong to blame everything only on the business unit, because business unit is also directly linked to the political economy of the country. If the government of India decides to cut down all the ads for your Rafael story, how can you blame the business unit? If the government of India decided to kill all ads for Telegraph for another story, can you blame the business unit? And just because government of India stopped the ads, some of the corporate entities take a cue from that. Okay, if I advertise in this publication, government of India may not like, but they stop the ads. There was a cascading effect. With all these things, if the state is becoming intolerant towards critical voices, that has an impact. The way it's a interlocking public is what we have to look at it. Unless and otherwise we are able to look at the various interlocking factors that operates this political economy of media, we may not be able to find an ideal answer. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks to everyone for your enthusiastic participation. We have lots of questions, several more questions in the chat box. However, due to paucity of time, we will not be able to address all the questions today. And I can already see that Madam Joseph is already addressing some questions in the chat box itself. Yeah, ma'am, you wanted to add something?
No, I just wanted to say that I have answered a couple of questions in the chat box. So.
Yes. So thank you so much. And now we would want to move on to the next item on the agenda. So I request Professor S.K. Behra, Session Chair, to summarize the deliberations and present the comments from the chair. Sir, you will need to unmute yourself. Sir, you will need to unmute.
Yeah, I have. Is it audible? Yeah, thank you, Anjuman. It was a pleasure hearing Paneer Selvanji and Madam Mahmood Joseph. And Madam Mahmood Joseph's book, I was reading right from 1996, Who's News? And then also The Women in Journalism. Those two books were, though I started my career in 81, yet those two books, when I was writing some papers on gender, I always referred to those books. So I was reading her, now I have listened to her. And about Paneer Selvanji, I was listening to him few days back. I listened to him what good journalism can do. Today, his talk basically is not what good journalism can do, but how we can practice good journalism. What are the problems of good journalism? What are the problems of public interest journalism? Why we are not being able to go into this? And when we talk about, he talked about the ethical deficit, which is not just a result of the pandemic, this pandemic, but it has a legacy. For the last 25, 30 years, this ethical deficit or trust deficit is always there. And he was also very rightly talking about the olden days, one deadline to today's multitasking and 13, 14 deadlines. So a journalist task has already become very, very difficult. And today we are not looking at the expertise, the domain expertise, what he was saying. We want that a journalist need to know something about everything. If we ask him, he has to write about astronomy, he has to write about science, he has to write about entertainment. So a kind of multitasker and having some knowledge about everything, that's the need of the hour. But before that, very rightly, our Vice Chancellor also talked about certain things. He talked about freedom versus spread of half-truth. And he also very rightly said that much of the depends on who is the leaders. Sometimes we get biased and we react to certain news differently. So we also have a role to play in this process of effective and public interest journalism and communication. It's not only about the content creators, but also we as consumers or readers or viewers, we have to identify what is good and what is not good for us. And he also talked about the explosion of information, that information overload, and the political leanings of journalists, and also the political parties pressure and other pressure groups which are working in the society, how they define the role of journalism and how they define the path of journalism in our country. So he gave the very recent Britain's legislation regarding the underreporting or misreporting about COVID with punitive actions, and India might be also thinking in those lines. Now, coming to Dr. Paneer Selvan's speech, he also talked about now. He said that in 2008 to 12 we were thinking of digital empowerment. Now, after that, now we are more into digital disruption. That's a very digital disruption. We say that we are digitally literate. We say that there are 686 million of internet users. We say that the world's largest Facebook users are here, WhatsApp and YouTube users are here, but it is the digital disruption which is more prominently visible to all of us. It is not the digital empowerment, but digital disruption. Very rightly, he has talked about the centralized power of the Silicon Valley, because it's a technology-driven media that we are living in today. And when technology-driven, where we are not going into the editorial side, we are looking at the technological power of the media and also the commercialization power. He talked about the reducing of the critical evaluation. We simply give facts, but we are stopping ourselves at critically evaluating, because there are no domain experts. Now again, domain expert, somebody very rightly said that if the profit of the media houses go down, how can we have more and more people? But that is not the problem, because it is the willpower, it's the mindset, because profits are coming, the advertisement, it's not the circulation revenue, it's actually the advertising. Some papers might face, and I'll be a little more skeptical in saying that it's not the government regulations. At times, the media themselves support a particular cause, support a particular party, they, for their own personal gains, they behave differently. And he rightly said that we are in a catch-22 situation where there is a war between the media managers who think in terms of sustainability and journalism for public good. Journalism, and in this process, actually, what is suffering is journalism for public good. Yet, I will suggest in a way that we need to become more media literate. What is required in today's world is media literacy. People in a people-driven, from technology-driven media, who need to become a people-driven media. It's not about what public wants, what is public interest journalism, but it's said what public is interested in. So we define actually what public is interested in. That may not be the sole truth, but we think and we perceive that public is interested in this and we need to provide them. And the most important thing is that we as consumers, we never want to pay for the content, but we always pay for the carrier. That's quite interesting. We are not responsible for the content. We readers, we want content. We want good content. We want entertaining content. But we do not want to pay for the content, but we are ready to pay for the carriers. We are paying 1,000 rupees, 1,500 rupees, 2,000 rupees for the carriers, but not for the content. That is a very unfortunate scene in our country. And regarding the press commissions, I have a submission here. Madam also talked about a lot about Press Council of India and its operation, about its membership, about we all know that it's a quasi-judicial body, and we always say that sometimes we jocularly say that it's a paperless tiger, it's a toothless tiger. Press Council of India does not have that much of judicial power or the power to punish somebody. They can only suggest. It's a suggestive. They can only suggest some actions. They can suggest to the government to stop advertisement to some newspapers, and they can suggest the newspaper organization to issue an apology, to publish an apology or a corrigendum on particular news. So, Press Council of India has never functioned properly in our country. The only thing is that they have been able to formulate a code of conduct, which again is I am not very sure whether all the newspapers or the media houses they look into that, because Hindu is fortunate enough to be the first newspaper in our country to have a reader's editor where he can guide the content, he can guide about the legality of the contents, he can guide about the public interest stories, he can guide about the developmental stories. That is, we are fortunate to have Paneer Selvan as the first news, a reader's editor of a newspaper. We also know that the ombudsman were there for the first time, but as reader's editor, many of my students do not understand what a reader's editor means. So now we are fortunate to have a reader's editor in Hindu, and as the Indian Newspaper Society chairman said once in 2008 that the media, the print never dies here in the East, it always rises and it sets in the West. That was true for some time, but today again, during the pandemic, we have seen that there is a lot of pressures on the print media. A lot of editions were closed and there was a lot of retrenchment. There were a lot of pay cuts, and the journalists were largely to suffer all these things. And the government also declared all the health sector workers, the doctors, the Anganwadi workers, and everybody, the firefighters, the electricians, everybody as the frontline workers to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. But journalists, though they were declared the frontline workers, but they were never given any benefit. They were not even given the PPE kit. They were not even given a long mic to cover their they were not given extra, forget about any extra benefit to look into their families' needs during those hours of need, but they were not paid properly. So journalists were the worst sufferers during this pandemic, and newspapers, as again I will say, it was not being circulated. So there was complete stoppage of newspaper publication or circulation, distribution for quite a long time, for which the print media suffered. And Professor Ammu Joshipji also talked very rightly about the gender participation, women representation, either in news gathering or in news coverage during the COVID times, which was not substantial, and it was biased towards male. And the report of the Bill and Melinda Gates report testified that. And the headlines also, she talked about 19% of only related to women and 77% for men. That was an unfortunate situation, but we are optimistic, and we will certainly think that the COVID pandemic will be over. But COVID will not certainly redefine the role of journalism in our country, the role of journalists. That is predetermined and predefined. COVID, this is an aberration in our journey of the profession. We have to think about our profession. Whether our profession is organized or not, it still is an unorganized profession, I will say. If you go to because journalism in metro cities is different, journalism is capital cities are different state capitals, and journalism in small places like Malkangiri in Odisha, in Assam, small places, they do not even get money. They are just given a card as a stringer, and they do not get even money. So when such is the situation, how can we expect for debates, it is good that we should be ethical. We all should be ethical. But how can the journalists be ethical? How can we expect them when they are not properly fed? They are not properly paid. That's the biggest question we need to think about. It's not about metro. And somebody was talking about the non-coverage of the Northeast. I tell you, the coverage, Odisha, I am from Odisha. Odisha is always covered only when there is a cyclone. It is known as the cyclone state, only when there is a tsunami. We have a chief minister who is ruling the state for the last 20-25 years. Unfortunately, Paneerselvam said, gave an example. If you want to report extreme poverty, and if you want to send somebody to Odisha, nobody is sending two reporters. Unfortunately, I will not agree with his remark. Odisha has improved a lot, but that mindset, that poverty is still very rampant in Odisha is unfortunate. Odisha has progressed a lot. Odisha has been doing well. And that extreme poverty, what we all were saying about Odisha, is visible even in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, because I keep visiting places. But Odisha has, from the times of Rajiv Gandhi, we have that image, and that image still continues with the mainstream media. That is unfortunate. So coverage is always limited to Delhi and the Hindi heartland. That is unfortunate, but that is the reality. So thank you very much, Paneerselvam Saab and Madam Ammu Joshipji, for these brilliant narratives that you have given about the profession, about the conduct of media, about the possibilities for future, and about the gender treatment by media, and also the press council, how they are functioning. Rather, I don't look at the idea of censor, but perhaps, I was talking in a webinar very recently that it is time for us like the Election Commission of India, instead of a Press Council of India, the government of India might even think about a Media Commission of India. I am not talking in the lines of first Press Commission, second Press Commission, but a Media Commission of India, a statutory legal body like Election Commission of India, which will have independent judiciary powers and which will be able to not regulate, which will be able to ensure ethical and good practices by media houses. It should not be a regulatory body, it should not be a censoring body, but it should be a facilitating body which must facilitate or ensure good practices in journalism and communication in our country. That is my humble submission, and thank you very much. Thank you, Anjuman, for giving me this opportunity. It was a pleasure for me to hear Paneerselvam Sahab and Ammu Joseph Madam. Thank you.
Thank you, Behra sir, for summarizing the sessions so lucidly and succinctly. So now we are moving towards the end of the program. And before we do, I would like to invite upon the convener of today's program, Professor Abhijit Bora, to kindly deliver the vote of thanks.
Abhijit, your mic.
Sorry. Thanks, Anjuman. Even though it's to some extent a kind of formality, yet it is also a way of expressing and putting on record our sincere thanks to the and gratitude to the invited persons as well as all others involved. And thanks especially also because both the invited speakers have accepted our request rather on a short notice, and despite today being the National Press Day, there might have been several other requests probably, but they have graced our department. We are very much obliged for that. And of course, we do have in mind an occasion on which both of you will be, would like to have both of you in our midst in person, so that for the benefit of our students. Thank you once again, Madam and Sir. My next thanks goes to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, for his encouraging words and to go ahead with the program and his inaugural speech. Thanks also to our HOD for our encouraging words as well as encouragement for moving ahead with the program. And despite a busy day for her, for delivering the state level lecture also. Then my sincere thanks goes to Professor Behra sir for his comments as well as for agreeing to chair the session and listen to all the things and everyone's comments and offer his own summary submission. I would like to thank Anjuman, Dr. Anjuman, for her sincere efforts in looking after the entire program from the anchoring part of point of view. It is a good effort, no doubt. Then my thanks goes to my colleagues from the department and colleagues from other institutions who have kindly joined and graced us, which is a moral booster for us. And then last but not the least, my thanks goes to all my students because and also students from several other institutions who have joined. This also gives us a big moral boost from a point of attendance and our say expansion of the program. We definitely like to have all of you amidst us in person in future on a different occasion, but till then we'll have to be satisfied with this via media kind of program, right? So a big thanks to all of you. And once again, my National Press Day wishes, and I hope all the students, all of you do prosper in your life, and especially for the students, try to imbibe some of the guidelines or some of the values which the research persons today have tried to communicate or inculcate amongst us, and you will succeed. And Corona thing will not succeed. Corona thing will not last forever. It'll be a matter of just 6 months or 1 year at the most. And so we shall overcome, and the sun will again rise very soon in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Bora. So with this, we come to the end of today's National Press Day celebrations with the Department of Mass Communication and Journalism, Tezpur University. We hope to meet all of you in person very soon and exchange our thoughts and ideas, and most importantly, share and spread warmth around. So thanks a lot. Best wishes to everyone. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you, Paneerselvan sir. Thanks to everyone for joining today.